Hey everyone. Settle in, get comfortable, maybe loosen the shoulders a bit. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into ancient Rome, a place of marble columns, expensive sandals, and the kind of social system that makes every modern workplace complaint feel pretty mild by comparison. If you've ever thought your boss was demanding, just imagine someone who literally owned you and could sell you to a guy who smelled like pickled fish without asking your opinion first. Welcome to Roman slavery, the most aggressively normal part of Roman society. Because why not build the greatest empire on earth and casually base it on forced labor? Classic Rome. So tonight, we're going to glide gently through what it meant to be a slave in Rome. Not with dramatic battle trumpets or gladiator fights, but in a more relaxing, wow, this is depressing, but in a monotone, bedtime way kind of style. Because nothing calms the mind quite like tax records, household hierarchies, ownership laws, and the steady realization that 40% of the population in some regions had zero personal rights. Cozy. Let's float back to around the 1st century BCE, when Rome was thriving, conquering everything in sight, and apparently had a policy of, if we run out of workers, just take some from the next city we invade. It worked out great for Rome, not so much for the people being carried home like human souvenirs. But in Roman thinking, this was business as usual. You lose a war, you lose your freedom. You get captured by pirates, same thing. You're born into slavery because your parents were slaves? Sorry, kid, better luck next lifetime. The interesting thing is that Romans didn't see slavery as morally questionable. They saw it like we see spreadsheets, boring but necessary. When everyone around you owns slaves, it becomes normal. That's what society does best, normalize things that should make us uneasy. Romans even joked about slaves. Comedies staged in Rome often had enslaved characters scheming, lying, and doing all the work while rich citizens wandered around looking useless. Audiences laughed. Slaves probably sat in the back thinking, yeah, hilarious, truly. Life for slaves varied depending on what kind of job you ended up with, and much like modern careers, some positions were worse than others. Being a household slave was basically the dream scenario. If you had to be owned, at least you worked indoors and maybe wore clean clothes. These were the people who waited tables, dressed their owners, maintained the courtyard garden, and pretended to be impressed when the master recited mediocre poetry after dinner, all very dignified. Ancient writers sometimes described these jobs as lucky because you weren't being worked to death in a mine. Household slaves could even develop real relationships with families. Some became trusted tutors and accountants, which is a strange career path when you started out as military loot. But still, early Romans could look at their personal financial manager and think, yes, my accountant is property. Farm slaves had it a little rougher. Agriculture was the engine of the empire, and someone had to harvest all the grain, olives, grapes, and whatever else Romans were shoving onto plates. Farm estates were massive economic machines, and farm slaves were the gears. They woke up early, worked long hours, and were overseen by middle management types called overseers. These guys were basically supervisors with a stick. If productivity was low, feedback came in the form of yelling and, occasionally, actual physical punishment. The Roman HR department was very straightforward. But even this was not the worst assignment. The absolute bottom shelf of ancient employment was working in the mines. Being sentenced to a mine was pretty much a slow-motion death sentence. No sunshine, no breaks, bad air, and zero chance of improving your situation. Mines were often stocked with criminals, prisoners of war, and anyone the Roman legal system wanted to forget existed. If workplace morale was ever measured, it probably scored around -7. One thing that often surprises modern readers is how organized Roman slavery actually was.
When you own half the population, you need paperwork. Rome had bills of sale, rental contracts, training records, slave markets, even insurance policies. It was incredibly tedious and incredibly efficient. If you needed a Greek tutor, a Spanish miner, or a Syrian glass craftsman, there was a market stall for that. Imagine window shopping for people. Rome could make anything transactional. Owners also had full legal power over slaves, and when I say full, I mean the legal equivalent of God mode.
A slave couldn't testify in court unless tortured first, because Romans believed you weren't trustworthy otherwise. Always inspiring when the justice system opens with, "Let's beat the truth out of him first." Though, to be fair, Romans beat confessions out of non-slaves sometimes too. Equal opportunity, just with more screaming. There were laws against excessively killing slaves, but enforcement was casual. If a slave was property, then destroying property was technically wasteful, but not necessarily evil. Public opinion might shame you a bit, but only if you did something cartoonishly brutal. So yes, Roman ethics had some wiggle room. You could be admired for being a kind and gentle slave master, or admired for being decisive and strict. Options. Living arrangements varied too. Household slaves often slept indoors, maybe near the kitchen or at the foot of the master's bed if they worked as personal attendants. Others slept in storage rooms. Mine and farm slaves sometimes lived in barracks, where the vibe was probably somewhere between military dorm and overcrowded storage shed. Privacy wasn't really a concept. When your legal status is animate tool, no one gives you your own bedroom. Now, despite all this, Roman slavery wasn't always static. Some slaves worked their way into better roles. Skilled individuals could become artisans, teachers, doctors, musicians, secretaries, and administrative assistants. Rome believed talent should be used, even if the person was technically property. The government itself had thousands of bureaucratic positions filled by slaves who basically ran public administration while senators argued about philosophical word choice. Imagine being a slave who processed military payroll records, doing complex accounting while technically not being allowed to own a wallet. Very Roman logic. But working in government wasn't the worst assignment. It made you visible, valuable, and sometimes socially connected. Rich citizens loved showing off their well-trained slaves. It made them look cultured, which was as important in Rome as having a granite countertop is today. Slaves also helped run businesses. Shopkeepers, bankers, construction crews, cooking schools, vineyard operations, shipping companies, metal workshops, you name it. Many wealthy Romans didn't run their own companies. Their enslaved staff did. And if profits went up, the owner looked brilliant. If things went badly, bad slave. Again, Roman accountability worked differently. Of course, slaves did not get paid. That would defeat the purpose. But some owners allowed slaves to save small amounts of money called peculium. It wasn't legally their money, but if they saved enough, they might buy their freedom. Peculum is one of those systems that looks generous until you think about it and realize it's the ancient version of saving up to purchase yourself from your employer. Very motivational. But surprisingly, manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was common. Romans loved freeing slaves, not necessarily because they were moral heroes. Freeing a slave could be a flex. Look how wealthy I am. I have so many enslaved workers that I can afford to release one without noticing. Some owners freed slaves in their wills, others did it while alive. Sometimes the motivation was affection, sometimes it was politics. Sometimes an owner wanted a loyal freedman to owe them favors in government, which is a very practical Roman networking strategy. Freed slaves became freedmen, a class of semi-citizens. They couldn't run for major office, but they could own property, start businesses, and live normal lives, which is a huge upgrade from, being owned. Many freedmen became wealthy entrepreneurs.
This frustrated old aristocrats who hated the idea of a former slave running a marble supply business while they were still arguing in the Senate about grain tariffs. Social mobility existed, and it annoyed traditionalists, which is always fun. But don't get too cozy with the redemption arc yet, because manumission was still uncommon compared to the total population. Most slaves never escaped their legal status. If you were born to enslaved parents, that was often the end of your story. Rome's elaborate social ladder was easier to admire from the bottom than to climb, and a lot of people stayed there permanently. Slavery also shaped Roman family life. Large households displayed servants like status trophies. Wealthy women had personal attendants who followed them everywhere, carrying perfumes, cosmetics, and whatever else they needed. Imagine having someone whose full-time job was holding your purse and occasionally agreeing with your fashion choices. That was actual employment in Rome. For young Roman boys, many were raised by enslaved Greek tutors. These tutors did the actual work of educating future senators and generals, while technically being property. Roman men grew up with vivid childhood memories of the enslaved adults who taught them Homer, mathematics, and good posture. Talk about complicated emotional dynamics. You couldn't respect your teacher too much because society said he wasn't a person, but also he was smarter than you. Roman households had emotional tension baked in from day one. Slaves even handled medical care. Households often had their own enslaved physicians because private healthcare wasn't a modern invention, it just used to come with chains. Imagine being sick in bed while the doctor checking your pulse has fewer rights than a broken wagon wheel. That was the system. Slavery was also deeply connected to Roman religion. If a household prayed, slaves arranged the shrine, lit incense, and cleaned up afterward. If the home sacrificed a chicken, guess who handled the logistics? If the household celebrated a birth, marriage, or funeral, slaves organized the catering. They were the invisible stage crew making elite Roman life operate smoothly. And Romans didn't even hide how essential slavery was. Philosophers wrote entire treatises calmly defending slavery as the natural order of the world. Aristotle famously argued that some people were born to command and others born to serve. Romans copied that logic like a student copying homework before class. As long as intellectuals kept writing these essays, owners could sleep at night without guilt. Convenient how that works. Let's glide over to the topic of slave markets for a moment. Ancient Rome had bustling auction spaces where newly captured slaves stood on platforms with price tags. Some had signs hanging from their necks listing skills and physical conditions, like a human version of a product description. Good teeth, speaks 2 languages, knows bookkeeping, slightly prone to sarcasm. Sold. Buyers could inspect merchandise. Sometimes auctions used dies to mark new arrivals so buyers knew they weren't yet acclimated and might run away. It was dehumanizing but extremely organized. Rome didn't do chaos unless it was a civil war. Everything else came with a handbook. Transportation was also part of the system. Slaves captured from distant provinces marched long distances to markets. Many never saw home again. The journey could take weeks with limited food and water. If someone died along the way, the traders shrugged and calculated profit margins. Business as usual. And yet, despite this entire system being horrifying by modern standards, Romans wrote about it with the same tone we use to discuss municipal taxes. Something like, yes, we should standardize slave pricing to improve trade efficiency. If a Roman economist time-traveled to today, they'd be baffled by labor laws, workplace safety guidelines, and the idea that employees can legally criticize management without being executed. Ultimately, Roman slavery created a world where huge numbers of people lived without autonomy, while the upper classes built statues, wrote poetry, and congratulated themselves for being civilized. It was the contradiction at the core of the empire. Rome called itself the pinnacle of culture, but depended entirely on people who would never enjoy that culture themselves. And yet, the system was stable for centuries. It didn't collapse because Romans suddenly felt bad. It collapsed because the empire changed, economies shifted, and new labor systems emerged. But those are stories for later.
For now, relax, breathe, and let the image of Roman society drift gently across the mind. Grand villas, polished marble floors, quiet gardens, and behind it all, the invisible hands that swept the floors, poured the wine, baked the bread, and never had the chance to choose a different life. Part 2, continuing the slow drift through Roman slave life. All right, settle a bit deeper into bed or couch or whatever horizontal surface you're currently melting into. We're staying in ancient Rome for a while longer because a system this large doesn't get explained in just one sleepy chapter. Tonight we float from daily life into the emotional landscape, the law, the weird social expectations, and the storytelling of people whose experiences mostly survived only through what their owners wrote. Always a reliable point of view. If you've ever wished you could read world history written entirely from the perspective of management, Rome delivers. Let's drift first into the quiet normality of a Roman morning. The elite household wakes up somewhere after sunrise, but the enslaved staff has already been awake for hours. There were fires to relight, floors to sweep, lamps to refill, beds to tidy, hot water to prepare, and breakfast ingredients to assemble. The wealthy Roman might slip lazily into a warmed robe without ever thinking about who warmed it. Behind the scenes was a constant ballet of human work, all engineered so that someone else could live a life soft enough to spend the day complaining about politics, theater performances, or the price of North African figs. One thing Roman writers mention often is how omnipresent slaves were. They were everywhere. Attendance was total. A wealthy person never carried anything. Not books, not clothes, not groceries, not scrolls, not travel bags. That's what human beings were for. Going for a walk? Bring 2 slaves. Going to the bathhouse? Bring 3 or 4. Going to the forum? Better bring someone to shade you, someone to make notes, someone to hold business documents, and someone to glare intimidatingly at lower-class people. It was a whole lifestyle. Now, from the inside, this creates a strange psychological environment. For a slave, constant proximity meant constant observation, no privacy, no personal space. Owners might develop real affection for enslaved people, but the power imbalance permeated everything. A household slave might nurse a child from infancy to adulthood, yet still get sold if the family needed cash. Imagine helping raise someone from birth, only to get transferred to a different household because someone bought too many pearls last month. Emotional whiplash was built into the system. And while we're on emotions, let's glide gently into something the Romans didn't talk about much, but which historians consider unavoidable: the stress, fear, and trauma involved in never owning yourself. Many enslaved people lived in a near-constant low-level anxiety, not a dramatic panic, just a steady tension. Any wrong word, any spilled cup of wine, any political shift, any change of owner could lead to punishment or worse. Romans didn't need a secret police agency. Social hierarchy took care of that automatically. Legally speaking, slaves were considered non-persons. They didn't have individual legal identity. A dog had about the same standing. If someone injured a slave, the owner might sue, not on behalf of the person, but on behalf of damaged property value. Again, it's remarkable how calmly Romans could turn human beings into accounting entries. Somewhere in a villa outside Pompeii, someone looked over a ledger and wrote something like, 1 lantern broken, 1 slave bruised, net loss 10 sesterces, and then moved on to lunch.
Now, not every Roman was comfortable with this system. A few philosophers, mostly Stoics, occasionally said something like, "Perhaps we should remember that slaves are humans with souls and feelings." This was considered very progressive. Seneca wrote letters telling masters to treat slaves with basic decency. He still owned slaves while writing this, but baby steps. In a Roman world, the bar for moral advancement was located somewhere around maybe don't beat people for no reason. It's like congratulating someone for deciding not to kick puppies anymore. Sure, glad you got there, eventually. Let's drift into punishment for a moment, though don't worry, we'll keep it monotone and not upsetting. Roman punishments were predictable, symbolic, and designed to reinforce hierarchy. For small mistakes like breaking dishware or dropping a tray, owners might respond with household discipline. For more serious things like theft or running away, punishments could escalate. The infamous Roman collar was sometimes used, a metal band placed around the neck with an inscription like, "I am a runaway. If you return me to my owner, you will be rewarded." So yes, humans were wearing actual lost pet tags, because the ancient world had no chill. Public punishments could be worse, but we'll drift past details, because the goal here is not emotional intensity, it's historical clarity with sleepy pacing. Just accept this. Roman law believed steady consequences preserved order, and enslaved people lived under those consequences every day. But despite all this heaviness, Roman slave society wasn't purely bleak. Humans can find small corners of joy in almost any circumstances. Enslaved people formed friendships, romantic relationships, alliances, informal support groups. Some even managed small independent microeconomies within the cracks of the system. Peculium, that tiny allowance slaves could accumulate, sometimes became the basis for underground economic activities. A slave with a talent, maybe woodworking, tailoring, or metal repair, might do evening work for clients and stash the earnings. The owner knew, of course, nothing in a Roman household happened unnoticed. But if the owner benefited indirectly, they often allowed the arrangement. Owners encouraged slaves to specialize. A well-trained slave was worth more on the market. So instead of teaching skills to children in schools, Romans taught skills to slaves and bought children tutors. It's the kind of inefficiency that only makes sense when labor is unlimited and free. Even within the brutal hiring structure, some enslaved workers rose surprisingly high. An imperial slave could manage territory, finances, or supply chains. They sometimes controlled more wealth than aristocrats. They just couldn't spend it for themselves. But imagine being the guy who manages payroll for 10,000 legionaries while not legally allowed to sign a contract. A strange existence. Some slaves became so trusted that their owners appointed them estate managers, business directors, or personal representatives. Outsiders might negotiate with them, report to them, even fear them, while still knowing they were technically property. Roman social dynamics could feel like a fever dream. Let's float into entertainment for a moment. One aspect of Roman life that often goes unnoticed is how slaves provided performance and pleasure. There were enslaved musicians, dancers, singers, comedians, jugglers, flute players, acrobats, and even enslaved actors. Stage performance carried a stigma, so wealthy people sometimes forced slaves into acting careers because it looked socially cleaner. Nothing says elite sophistication quite like having a personal troupe of performers you can fire or sell at will. Meanwhile, slaves cooked every meal. They went to the markets, selected food, baked bread, roasted meat, prepared sauces, and cleaned the kitchen afterward. Roman cuisine had everything from stuffed dormice to honey-glazed fish. Good cooking took talent. Roman diners would rave about a delicious dinner, while sometimes forgetting to acknowledge the enslaved cook whose professional pride was the only thing they personally owned. One humorous detail, Wealthy Romans sometimes had slaves whose only job was to remind them of names during parties. Social connections were complicated. So, walking into a banquet, you might have someone behind you whispering, "That's Marcus, the one who lent you money at 6% interest." It's similar to having LinkedIn, but in human form. Now, we should glide softly toward health, since that also shaped enslaved lives. Roman medicine was a mix of empirical observation and, let's hope Jupiter figures this out.
Household doctors, often enslaved Greeks, handled injuries, chronic illnesses, childbirth, and herbal treatment. They were respected professionally, but still owned. If you treated your master's gout successfully, you might be rewarded. If he died anyway, maybe not. Medicine was stressful even back then. But illnesses weren't only medical crises, they were economic ones. A sick slave meant lost labor, lost profit, and possible replacement cost. Owners calculated medical treatment based on value. It's dark, but also extremely Roman. If the slave was highly skilled, they got good treatment. If not, well, Rome wasn't known for universal health care. Let's float over to the topic of rebellion. Contrary to popular imagination, most slaves didn't revolt. Not because they were content, but because rebellion was impractical. The Roman state had enormous military resources. Armed uprisings usually ended quickly and dramatically. Gladiator revolts like Spartacus were famous not because they were common, but because they were rare and terrifying to authorities. For every Spartacus, there were thousands of quiet, private acts of resistance, working slowly, delaying tasks, breaking tools, small thefts, or forming secret alliances. Historians call this everyday resistance because humans will always find ways to bend systems that confine them. Something else interesting, slaves produced an enormous portion of Roman writing and record-keeping. Letters, bills, archives, contracts, speeches. Many were physically written down by enslaved scribes. Yet almost none of their writing survives in their own words. History recorded their labor, but rarely their voices. The people who documented Rome are silent in the documents themselves. It's one of the most haunting absences in ancient history. Now, let's move to the household structure, which had a hierarchy even among slaves. At the top were the trusted positions: stewards, senior tutors, literary assistants, business managers, and skilled artisans. They slept indoors, wore better clothes, and sometimes earned respect, even affection. Below them were the domestic staff who cleaned, cooked, carried supplies, maintained clothing, and handled daily life. They were the heartbeat of the household. Beneath them, field laborers. At the bottom, the mines and quarries. Someone had to extract marble for that expensive bathhouse you never asked for. Sadly, someone also had to die doing it. Slave children added another layer. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves themselves. Romans rarely bothered with moral justification. It was a simple equation. Children were valuable assets. Some estate owners set up entire breeding operations. Yes, farming humans like livestock. Rome had that kind of chilling economic pragmatism. But not every child lived a bleak life. Children raised in wealthy households might receive education alongside the owner's children. Some formed deep sibling-like emotional bonds. And then came puberty, when reality set in. One child inherited the house, the other inherited the housework. Let's drift toward manumission again, because it shaped Roman culture more than you'd expect. Freedmen became a visible new social class. Many joined professional guilds. Some ran theaters, bathhouses, taverns, shipping companies, or construction firms. They could become wealthy enough to own slaves themselves, which is bleak but historically common. Social mobility existed, but carried a dose of irony. Meanwhile, old aristocrats complained loudly about new money nobodies invading polite society. A senator might grumble about a freedman billionaire owning 5 apartment buildings in the Sabora district while he himself was struggling to maintain a fancy ancestral villa. Essentially, ancient Rome had the first wave of immigrant business success angers old landowners. Roman literature is full of subtle digs. A writer might describe someone with impeccable manners, fine clothing, and a massive house, then slip in the line, "He was once a slave." It was meant as shade. But it also shows how far freedmen could rise. And then there were funerals. Roman tomb inscriptions tell us a surprising amount. Freedmen often commissioned elaborate tombs with long inscriptions detailing their life achievements. If you spent decades being legally invisible, carving your story into stone was the closest thing to immortality. Many tombs show husbands and wives who had both been enslaved, built businesses together, bought freedom, and honored each other in death. Human resilience at its finest. Let's glide gently to religion, where magic and superstition lived alongside law and economics. Slaves prayed to household gods, often with private wishes owners never heard. Some prayed for better treatment. Some prayed for freedom. Some prayed for divine justice. We have curse tablets written by freedmen cursing rivals, neighbors, or business competitors. It turns out that once you taste freedom, ancient pettiness comes right back. Finally, let's drift to the question people often ask. Did Romans ever consider ending slavery altogether? Short answer, not really. The system was too profitable, too normal, too baked into daily life. It collapsed not through moral evolution, but through historical change. As the empire shifted, military expansion slowed, fewer war captives flowed into the system, new labor systems emerged, and the economy gradually reorganized. Christianity later added pressure, but mostly in small, gradual steps. Slavery changed form before it ended. For now, picture Rome at sunset. Torches lit along garden pathways, laughter from the dining room, soft sandals on mosaic floors. Slaves clearing tables, washing plates, preparing tomorrow's bread, stoking fires so the master's bathwater will be pleasantly warm at dawn. Homes filled with quiet motion, unseen, constant, and uncredited. Part 3. The Economy, Politics, and Quiet Persistence of Roman Slaves. All right, let's sink further into the gentle hum of Roman life. Picture yourself leaning back, maybe half asleep, as we continue our slow journey into a world where wealth, politics, and human labor intertwined like marble columns and creeping ivy. Tonight, we're drifting over markets, public works, imperial bureaucracy, and the subtle ways slaves shaped everything without ever truly being allowed to shape their own destinies. It's a world of paperwork, bread, and human resilience, the kind of history that lulls you into contemplation rather than adrenaline. Economically, Rome was a massive engine, and slaves were the pistons. Without them, the empire couldn't function. Farms, workshops, mines, households, and public offices all depended on enslaved labor. The more ambitious your family, the more likely it was that at least half of your assets were not land, gold, or buildings, but people. Picture a villa in Pompeii, a grand house with fountains, murals, a Paris-style garden, and dozens of humans orchestrating every moment of daily life. This was standard, nothing exotic, nothing scandalous, just practical empire management. Public works were similarly dependent. Roads, aqueducts, baths, temples, forums, everything monumental you've seen in pictures required thousands of hands. Most workers were enslaved or conscripted laborers who spent years digging, hauling, mixing, and finishing. Aqueduct builders often worked with water rushing past in extreme heat or in partially collapsed tunnels. It was slow, methodical labor. Modern construction safety standards would have been laughably absent. Romans didn't prioritize it. They prioritized getting the aqueduct working yesterday. Some slaves even worked in administration for the state itself. These were the invisible bureaucrats of Rome. They kept records, tallied taxes, managed shipments, and documented census information. In some ways, they ran the empire. Yet history mostly records the patricians who approved budgets, not the enslaved scribes who calculated them. Imagine balancing the empire's books while technically having zero legal identity. That's dedication. Politics also relied heavily on enslaved labor. Candidates for office often needed massive displays of generosity to gain popularity. Think feasts, games, spectacles, donations. Who ran the kitchens, prepared the food, choreographed the events? Slaves, of course. The wealth displayed publicly was an illusion. Public admiration was aimed at the candidate, not the dozens of invisible workers who made the grandeur possible. One could argue that Roman elections were, at their core, subtle human exploitation contests. But don't stress too much. Just imagine it as a slow, historical slide into complexity while sipping something warm. Interestingly, some slaves gained influence through these political channels. Trusted slaves could manage campaign logistics, advise on finances, and maintain correspondence with supporters. They had power in a quiet, indirect way. One could even say they exercised soft influence over the empire's direction, though always from beneath the ceiling of ownership. It's a kind of paradoxical authority, enormous responsibility without the right to own or decide. Let's drift gently into daily routines. Farm slaves woke before dawn. Bread had to be baked, animals fed, fields tilled, irrigation maintained. Hours stretched on, punctuated by occasional oversight. Supervisors walked the property, stick in hand, counting work, noting errors, sometimes offering brief praise if a particular field looked tidy. One can imagine the rhythm, monotonous, repetitive, unending. It's almost hypnotic, perfect for our sleep-inducing exploration. Household slaves had a different rhythm, but equally relentless. Kitchens, baths, gardens, and personal care demanded constant attention. They handled meals, water, clothing, furniture, and the endless whims of the elite. Mistakes were noted, successes mostly invisible. Yet some household slaves learned strategies for relative comfort. They memorized preferences, anticipated needs, and sometimes became indispensable. A skilled domestic slave might even influence minor decisions, like which wines were stored or which routes were taken to the forum. Subtle power, always tethered to ownership. Now about education. Many wealthy Roman children learned from enslaved tutors. Often Greek, sometimes philosophers themselves, these educators were legally property, but intellectually free in ways no one else in the house was. They shaped the minds of future senators, generals, and writers. They taught rhetoric, literature, mathematics, and philosophy, all while legally being things rather than people. This makes their quiet contribution to history both immense and unrecognized. Imagine educating the rulers of an empire while forbidden from holding office or owning a single property. A strange but effective arrangement. Healthcare was another domain where slaves played a critical role. Enslaved physicians treated family members, oversaw childbirth, prepared remedies, and sometimes ran entire medical facilities. The status difference between healer and patient was stark. A doctor could be better educated and more skilled than the patient, yet socially inferior. It's like trusting a world-class surgeon who isn't allowed to drive a car or vote. Rome excelled at cognitive dissonance. Religion, too, intertwined with slavery. Household gods required offerings, ritual maintenance, and shrine cleaning. Slaves handled all of it. Festivals, prayers, and sacrifices, performed under the owner's name, but executed by someone else entirely. Even temple workers were often enslaved.
Religious experience, one of the most intimate aspects of life, was delegated. Devotion existed, but its conduits were mostly uncredited humans. It's subtle, almost meditative in its quiet irony. Let's drift now into the cultural influence of slaves. Many artistic contributions, music, theater, sculpture, and literature, were produced by enslaved hands. Actors, poets, and performers often belonged to someone else. A celebrated play could be performed by someone legally owned, while critics wrote raves about its culture without ever acknowledging the labor behind it. Slavery thus infiltrated Roman aesthetic life in every form. From wall frescoes to epic poetry recitations, the hands that made art move were often property. And yet, despite all this control, human creativity survived. Slaves adapted, resisted quietly, formed social bonds, and nurtured children. Peculium allowed for savings, small business endeavors, and even eventual freedom. Many slaves learned skills, built networks, and sometimes managed to purchase their own liberty. Freedmen who started from nothing sometimes became wealthy or influential. Rome's social system, oppressive as it was, contained tiny crevices of opportunity for clever or skilled individuals. Even within strict hierarchy, there was nuance. Senior slaves could command junior slaves. Skilled artisans could train apprentices. Experienced household attendants could advise owners, negotiate schedules, and influence minor decisions. Authority existed, but always within the invisible walls of ownership. It's a layered system of power and restriction, subtle enough to lull you into contemplation. Transportation of slaves is another detail worth floating over. Captives from distant lands were marched in chains, sometimes for hundreds of miles. Markets awaited them, and the chain of ownership continued. Slaves had no say in where they went or who would own them. Life became a sequence of locations, duties, and observers. Personal agency was mostly absent. And yet, in some cases, they formed networks, friendships, and quiet communities along these journeys. Humans adapt remarkably well to even the harshest circumstances. Entertainment also played a role in daily life. Many wealthy households had enslaved musicians, dancers, acrobats, and entertainers. They performed constantly, never for themselves, but for approval, admiration, and sometimes reward from owners. Their skill was necessary, visible, yet never legally recognized. Imagine perfecting your craft and living in a state of legal invisibility. Rome thrived on this invisible brilliance. Finally, let's drift toward the psychological landscape. The lives of slaves were monotonous, predictable, and filled with subtle forms of resistance, creativity, and endurance. The patterns of daily labor, hierarchy, and supervision created a rhythm. Early morning wake-ups, repetitive chores, quiet intellectual work, occasional praise, rare manumission, and endless observation. Life moved like a slowly turning clock. It was oppressive, yet humans found ways to persist quietly, build relationships, and retain fragments of identity. So, as night deepens and the mind relaxes into the cadence of Roman life, imagine villas, workshops, baths, roads, and fields all humming with unseen human effort. Slaves swept floors, baked bread, carved marble, maintained records, performed rituals, taught philosophy, and shaped culture. And all of this happened while the empire grew, marble columns rose, and statues of emperors celebrated power that depended entirely on invisible hands. Part 4. Personal Lives and Quiet Stories of Roman Slaves. All right, ease back into your pillow or chair and let your eyes soften. Tonight, we drift closer to the human side of Rome's enslaved population, the subtle emotional landscapes, and the quiet resilience that kept people going under conditions most of us can hardly imagine. Remember, this isn't dramatic storytelling with cliffhangers or shouting, just a slow, steady glide through history, like floating down a calm river. Let's start with family. Enslaved people had families, but legal bonds didn't exist. Children born to enslaved mothers became property automatically. Husbands and wives could live together or be separated at the whim of owners. One can imagine quiet despair mixed with moments of tenderness. Some households allowed families to stay together if it was convenient, others didn't. The personal lives of slaves existed in a space between private affection and public invisibility. And yet, human attachment persisted. Older siblings might care for younger ones. Couples found ways to maintain intimacy, often in secret. Friends provided emotional support. Within a household or a barracks, networks of solidarity formed. They were fragile, easily broken, yet crucial for endurance. The ability to maintain these relationships quietly, under constant oversight, is one of the most impressive and understated aspects of Roman slavery. Some slaves found purpose in their work beyond mere survival. Skilled artisans, musicians, and teachers often took pride in their craft. A potter shaping clay, a scribe copying texts, a teacher instructing children. They exercised intellect and creativity, even while constrained. Success was fleeting and unrecognized officially, but it offered a sense of identity. These were the small sparks of autonomy in an otherwise rigid system. We can also consider emotional labor. Slaves attended to the moods, preferences, and whims of their owners. They smiled when the master or mistress frowned, laughed at jokes that were not funny, and anticipated desires before they were spoken. This constant performance could be exhausting, but it was a skill. Many household slaves became adept at social navigation, reading subtle cues and influencing minor decisions without overt authority. Subtle power, if carefully exercised, could make life marginally easier. Religion and superstition offered another quiet refuge. Household gods were cared for by slaves. They maintained shrines, offered prayers, and performed rituals. Some slaves had personal devotions, praying for protection, health, or freedom. Curse tablets exist in the archaeological record. Tiny pieces of lead inscribed with pleas for revenge or justice. The prayers of slaves were both mundane and deeply human, a way to claim agency, however small, in a world where legal autonomy was denied. Let's drift into small acts of resistance, which were more common than large-scale rebellions. Slaves might work slowly, break tools, misplace items, or feign ignorance. These were everyday strategies for regaining a tiny fraction of control. Rebellion, as we discussed, was rare because Rome's military infrastructure made success improbable. But quiet resistance, slow, invisible, cumulative, was a way to survive psychologically. Think of it as a whisper rather than a shout. Education offered an avenue for subtle influence too. Tutors, often Greek or Syrian, educated the next generation of Roman elites. While technically property, they shaped the minds of future senators, generals, and thinkers. Their knowledge, discipline, and moral guidance influenced Rome indirectly. One could argue these educators contributed more to cultural continuity than many of the very people who owned them. The irony is quiet but significant. Entertainment was another sphere where enslaved labor flourished. Musicians, dancers, acrobats, and actors performed constantly. Their skill was necessary, their presence visible, yet legally they were property. Some performed at grand feasts or public games. Even if the audience admired their talent, it rarely translated into freedom. Yet the experience of performing, of creating beauty, offered a kind of personal satisfaction. Art became a private oasis of expression in a public world of ownership. Health and medicine were similarly entwined with personal and professional life. Enslaved physicians treated injuries, diseases, and childbirth. Their knowledge gave them influence over life and death, yet they remained property. Successfully treating an illness could earn small rewards or increased security, yet failure, often through no fault of their own, carried risk. The emotional tension of responsibility without autonomy is subtle but persistent. Life in Rome was filled with such nuanced pressures. Friendship and camaraderie offered small reliefs. Shared meals, quiet conversation, or subtle jokes within a household or barracks strengthened bonds. These relationships were essential for survival, emotionally and practically. Allies could help with chores, warn of impending punishments, or lend advice on navigating the social dynamics of the household. Human networks quietly supported endurance, much like threads holding together an otherwise fragile tapestry. The process of manumission created its own dynamics. Freed slaves often maintained ties with former owners. Loyalty, gratitude, and obligation mingled with resentment and strategy. Freedmen could enter the lower tiers of Roman society, engage in trade, run businesses, and sometimes amass wealth. They were a visible reminder of the complex interplay between oppression and opportunity. Their stories often reflect quiet triumphs and subtle ironies. Once property, now influential citizens, sometimes employing slaves themselves. History loves these layers. Let's drift to the personal identities of slaves. Many preserved individuality through skill, personality, and memory. Names mattered. Some slaves were known by personal names rather than the generic servus, slave. Artistic talent, literacy, humor, or ingenuity could distinguish one person in a sea of laborers. Roman society largely ignored these distinctions legally, but socially they had significance. Within households and among peers, reputation and skill mattered. It gave life texture, even when legal recognition was denied. Finally, consider the long-term persistence of these systems. Slavery shaped Roman demographics, economy, culture, and psychology. It allowed massive urbanization, monumental architecture, and imperial administration. It also created emotional landscapes defined by invisibility, resilience, subtle rebellion, and human ingenuity. The quiet labor of millions enabled the grandeur of Rome, yet history often remembers the empire's rulers and not the invisible hands that supported them. As you drift deeper into sleep or relaxation, imagine the sounds and rhythms of Roman daily life. The quiet steps of household slaves, the rhythmic hammering of artisans, the soft mutters of tutors explaining grammar, the distant voices of a market, the lapping of water against aqueducts. All of it is sustained by human effort that is mostly invisible in history, yet central to the functioning of a vast empire. Part 5. Unusual Stories and Subtle Heroism Among Roman Slaves. Okay, let's sink a little further into the soft rhythm of ancient Rome. Close your eyes if you want. Let the mind float over sunlit courtyards, mosaics, and the quiet clatter of daily work. Tonight, we focus on individual stories and subtle heroism, the little acts that allowed enslaved people to survive, preserve dignity, and sometimes even shape their worlds, all while legally being property. It's slow, calm, and slightly ironic, the kind of history that lulls rather than excites. Some slaves gained reputations within households for unusual skill or temperament. Take, for instance, the household guardian, a position occasionally entrusted with considerable responsibility. A master might give a slave oversight of storage rooms, finances, or minor managerial duties. In some families, these guardians could wield authority over other slaves, effectively running part of the household. They were still property, but they had influence. Imagine supervising dozens of people while officially being an object. There's a quiet cleverness in that.
Then there were artisan slaves, potters, sculptors, metalworkers, and jewelers. Some created masterpieces admired by Romans for centuries. Their work adorned temples, villas, and public spaces. The hands that molded marble, cast bronze, or shaped intricate jewelry often belonged to individuals who could not legally sell, own, or display their creations. Yet, through their labor, they left a mark on culture that outlived their personal invisibility. It's ironic. Art remembered, artist forgotten. We also see examples of emotional intelligence used strategically. Household slaves sometimes became mediators, smoothing tensions between family members or helping young masters navigate social life. A tutor might quietly shape a child's manners and knowledge while maintaining the necessary deference. A personal attendant might know exactly when to speak and when to remain silent.
These subtle interventions could protect a slave's position, earn small privileges, or even influence outcomes in important family matters. Quiet power is its own kind of survival skill. Religion offered another subtle form of personal agency. Some slaves performed rituals for household gods in ways that reflected their own beliefs or hopes. Certain devotions were private, others intertwined with public performance. Curse tablets are an especially intriguing record, small inscribed pieces of lead asking deities to intervene in disputes, punish enemies, or influence romantic prospects. Even while legally invisible, some slaves exercised spiritual influence, an internal life that law could not touch. The emotional resilience of enslaved families is also striking. Couples found ways to maintain connection despite frequent separations, transfers, or sales. Children often formed bonds with older slaves who became surrogate parents, educators, and guides. Friendships within barracks or workshops allowed small communities to flourish quietly. These social networks didn't erase oppression, but they softened the experience of daily life. Bonds became lifelines, quiet victories in a world designed to strip agency. Revolts were rare, but small acts of defiance were common. A slow pace in fieldwork, misplacing tools, feigning illness, or clever miscommunication were low-risk ways to regain tiny amounts of control. Historians call this everyday resistance, and it reflects human persistence in the face of systemic restriction. Most acts were invisible to history, but cumulative effects mattered. A slightly delayed harvest, a subtly corrected account, a quiet act of solidarity. The rhythm of work itself could become a canvas for small personal agency. Some slaves became literate and educated, gaining access to knowledge forbidden to most. Tutors, scribes, and clerks often developed considerable intellectual capacity. These individuals could read, write, and calculate, sometimes managing financial affairs for the elite. Their influence was indirect but real. Letters written, accounts balanced, bureaucratic systems maintained, all by hands considered legally non-persons. This is a quiet form of power, shaping society without recognition. Freedmen's stories provide another layer. Upon manumission, individuals could integrate into society, conduct business, and even become wealthy. Some purchased slaves themselves, entering the paradoxical cycle of property ownership. Others ran workshops, bathhouses, or small shipping enterprises. Their previous enslavement shaped networks, discipline, and skills that facilitated later success. Social mobility was limited but possible, leaving traces of quiet triumph. In households, some slaves gained respect through trustworthiness, discretion, and competence. Trusted positions included financial managers, estate supervisors, and personal companions.
Their proximity to power allowed influence over decisions, even if they could not legally act independently. It was an odd form of soft power, shaping events, guiding people, yet bound to the legal and social framework of ownership. Entertainment offered a similar paradox. Slaves trained as musicians, actors, dancers, and performers contributed visibly to culture, yet legally remained property. Their talent could elicit admiration, generate income, or entertain guests. Skill provided a limited buffer against abuse and offered rare recognition. Still, it existed within a system where applause did not equal freedom. Transportation and markets shaped personal trajectories as well. Captives from distant lands were marched in chains, sold at auctions, and integrated into households or workshops far from home. Each transfer reshaped social networks and emotional bonds. In some cases, small communities formed within barracks, markets, or ships. Survival often depended on alliances, knowledge of routines, and subtle social navigation. Healthcare further illustrates the interplay of skill and invisibility. Enslaved physicians and midwives cared for family members, trained apprentices, and maintained household medical knowledge. Their work influenced health outcomes and, indirectly, wealth. Successes could enhance status within the household, failures carried risk. The combination of skill, responsibility, and lack of legal protection created a persistent tension that shaped daily life. Some slaves engaged in small economic activities. Peculium allowed them to accumulate minor savings, invest in tools, or negotiate small transactions. Creative management of peculium could lead to eventual manumission or modest material improvement. This small pocket of autonomy was psychologically important, proof that even under legal invisibility, human ingenuity could persist. Finally, consider the emotional landscape of endurance. Daily routines, hierarchical pressures, supervision, and economic exploitation were omnipresent. Yet within this monotony, small victories occurred. Successful tasks, friendships, minor privileges, spiritual practice, mastery of craft, and strategic navigation of household life. Each day survived was itself a quiet triumph. As night deepens around you, picture the rhythms of these lives. Hands kneading bread, quills scratching ink, sandals shuffling on mosaic, the soft laughter of companions, murmured prayers, and the quiet satisfaction of tasks completed. It's a world structured by ownership, yet filled with subtle humanity, cleverness, and endurance. The contrast between public invisibility and private agency is gentle, pervasive, and endlessly complex. Part 6. Traces of Lives, Letters, Inscriptions, and the Quiet Memory of Roman Slaves. All right, let's continue our gentle drift through the empire, imagining faint echoes of voices long gone. Tonight, we focus on the traces left behind, letters, inscriptions, and records that give us fleeting glimpses into individual lives. It's a quiet sort of archaeology, piecing together personality, skill, and endurance from the faintest hints, perfect for a sleepy, contemplative evening. One of the richest sources of insight comes from funerary inscriptions. Tombstones often recorded names, relationships, and even achievements of freedmen and sometimes slaves. You'll see inscriptions like Lucius, freedman of Gaius, skilled in accounting, beloved by his family, or Claudia, once a slave, cared for this household, now remembered with honor. These are the few places where legally invisible people became visible in memory. It's subtle, quiet, and full of human pathos. No dramatic flair, just acknowledgement. Letters and papyri provide another glimpse. In Egypt, for instance, thousands of papyrus letters survive that record transactions, work orders, and family affairs. Many were written by slaves or freedmen on behalf of their owners. Reading them is like peeking into daily life. Deliver 3 amphorae of oil to the villa, don't spill any. Or, the barley has arrived, please check quality. Tiny, mundane tasks, but they represent authority and responsibility exercised by someone legally invisible. There's a quiet dignity in that, isn't there? Sometimes we catch hints of personality. A letter might show a scribe's impatience, humor, or careful attention to detail. Some papyri even hint at negotiations, a slave advocating for small privileges, a freedman reminding a client of obligations. These aren't dramatic scenes, they're little ripples of agency in the vast river of the empire. Let's pause on a few unusual examples. One inscription from Ostia commemorates a woman named Felicitas, formerly enslaved, who had been a baker. She is described as faithful and industrious, but the note also mentions that she taught her craft to younger slaves. So there's mentorship and skill transmission happening quietly behind the scenes. Skills mattered, even if society didn't formally recognize them. Another example. A tomb in Rome records a slave named Marcus who served as a secretary in a wealthy household. His epitaph highlights precision, trustworthiness, and loyalty. He had managed accounts, correspondence, and inventories. Legally, he was property. Socially, he was indispensable. Emotionally, he likely navigated a complex landscape of gratitude, fear, and subtle pride. Small human victories, tucked into stone and ink, echo faintly across centuries. Some inscriptions even hint at humor or personal reflection. A freedman might note, "Once enslaved, now free, and still reminding you to pay your debts." The irony isn't loud, it's quiet, knowing, slightly sardonic. It's the Roman equivalent of a resigned smile after decades of careful maneuvering. These small traces remind us that even in oppressive circumstances, personality endured. Let's drift into legal records for a moment. Manumission documents often survive, detailing conditions under which a slave was freed. Sometimes these records required the slave to continue working part-time for the former owner or to provide financial compensation. Freedom wasn't instant bliss, it was gradual, negotiated, cautious. Yet it represented a fundamental shift in agency, from property to personhood. Even small steps mattered. We can also observe patterns of naming. Freed slaves often took the names of their former owners or added new names, creating a blend of identity and history. So someone might be called Gaius Julius Felix, where Gaius Julius references the former master, and Felix, meaning fortunate, signals a new chapter. Names here carry memory, gratitude, irony, and subtle pride all at once. Slaves in the imperial bureaucracy sometimes appear in official records, often as assistants or scribes. Their duties were substantial, managing logistics, writing correspondence, keeping inventories. Yet their names appear occasionally, almost like whispers. One can imagine the quiet knowledge. This work shapes empire-level decisions, but you have no title, no office, no official recognition. It's a persistent, ironic tension that echoes through history. Small acts of cultural contribution also survive. Musicians, actors, and performers, sometimes enslaved, appear in inscriptions or graffiti praising their skill. One actor might be noted for masterful voice and grace, another for steadiness in difficult performances. Their lives were constrained, their freedom limited, yet the quality of their work left faint traces in memory. It's a subtle form of immortality. Let's glide toward domestic life. Some household slaves left indirect traces through literature written by elite Romans. Tutors appear in letters and essays. Household stewards are mentioned in anecdotes about good management or cleverness. These brief mentions rarely acknowledge the labor's full scope, but they provide glimpses into the human effort behind smooth social and economic life. We also see evidence of creativity. Some slaves wrote poetry, composed letters for their masters, or even crafted clever solutions for daily problems. Their contributions often survive anonymously, yet they remind us that skill, intelligence, and wit were never completely suppressed. Even under total control, small corners of self-expression persisted. And then there's endurance, the quiet persistence of daily life, rising before dawn, managing tasks, navigating hierarchy, forming friendships, praying privately, created a rhythm that was both monotonous and resilient. The empire functioned because millions of people sustained it quietly, day by day, without recognition. This endurance is one of the most profound aspects of Roman slavery. Finally, consider the contrast. The grandeur of Rome, marble temples, political triumphs, lavish villas, was only possible through invisible human labor. The empire's shine was polished by countless hands that left minimal trace. Yet, through inscriptions, letters, and subtle evidence of skill, we glimpse these lives. They weren't dramatic, spectacular, or loud. They were persistent, skilled, and quietly heroic. And sometimes that quiet heroism is enough to lull the mind toward reflection and rest. As you continue to drift, imagine small vignettes. A scribe copying letters by candlelight, a baker shaping bread at dawn, a musician practicing scales quietly in a courtyard, a tutor guiding young masters, a steward quietly correcting an error in accounts. All of it is part of a vast, unseen machinery. Invisible labor, small acts of resistance, quiet persistence, the slow hum of life that sustained an empire.